Hi, I'm Tom Baty. I'm here today to tell you why I love model trains. And I'm also going to give you a little bit of a history about how toy trains gradually became model trains. You know, when I was a kid, my earliest memory was my parents taking me to a bridge in Des Moines, Iowa, and watching the steam engines shoot around underneath the bridge. And of course, other kids saw trains. Trains started coming across the United States in the 1840s. And that was an important thing for kids because they saw the trains and they wanted the trains as toys. I can remember myself wanting toy trains. I can remember, for example, maybe this was 45 or 46. I was at Yonkers department store in Des Moines. And of course, being a kid, I had to go talk to Santa. And of course, once I got on his knee, I said, "Santa, I want a train for Christmas." Well, can you imagine what Santa had to say? This was probably 45, the first year that trains were being remade after World War II. And Santa shook his head. I wasn't going to get a train. The next year, I had a little better luck, though. I noticed that I was not supposed to go down to the basement anymore. This was a few days before Christmas. And I could hear banging around. So I knew my father was down there. But no, you can't go down in the basement. On Christmas Day, I finally had my chance. And I went downstairs, and here my father had constructed a 4x8 train set, a circle track, an American Flyer train. He had even built a station for it. And he even built a papier-mâché mountain. The papier-mâché mountain, though, was painted yellow. Well, I guess on Christmas Eve it was probably kind of hard to get some green paint. That probably was his problem. That first train was an American Flyer. It was all made out of metal. The locomotive was cast. The cars were very colorful. And in those days, American Flyer was still O-gauge. So in other words, there were 3 rails. And maybe that was a good thing because later on, after American Flyer became S-gauge and then went to 2 rails, I was able to incorporate my American Flyer in with my Lionel trains. Railroads started crossing America in the 1840s, and kids saw these trains. Naturally, being kids, they fell in love with them. It was action, and they could see them move, and they wanted toys that expressed this movement. The first toys were actually made out of wood trains that the kids would pull across the floors. They would have them attached with string, and they could pull them, and it would kind of imitate a train. Later, they became a little bit more sophisticated. Let's take a look at a cast iron train. This was an improvement over what kids had had before. A train that was a bit more realistic. It actually looked like the trains of that particular time. And again, the kids would get a bunch of cars all tied together, and they could pull these across the floor. Now, this was a wonderful toy, but the problem with it, it's heavy and it's made out of cast iron. And by the way, if you drop it on the floor, cast iron is going to shatter just like glass. This particular one belonged to an older uncle of mine who died many, many years ago. And he had the whole set, a tender and even a caboose. The other cars had all been broken up, so they were already gone at that point. The next innovation that happened was that finally they got more clever and they made these trains mechanical. A good example is this Marx train, and it's a wind-up. It has a key. You insert the key, you wind it up, and it pulls a group of train cars. Now, the way the kids actually use this is they would have a circle of track, and then they would have probably 2 stations on that circle. And if they were very, very clever, what they would do is they would wind it up just enough so that the train would go from one station to another. A little bit of action. And there's another thing you need to remember about trains. Electricity was slow to come to most parts of America. It hit the East Coast first, and then the West Coast. But in between, we had the Great Midlands, and there wasn't electricity on the farms in the Midwest. So a kid on a farm, maybe in Iowa or Illinois, he had to rely on this wind-up train. Now, Marx kind of stayed with wind-up trains for most of their career. So they were even making wind-up trains in the 1950s, probably because there were kids who still didn't have electricity. They had one other advantage, though. They were cheap to make, they were colorful, and if you didn't have much money and a kid wanted a train, this was a way to go. Finally, the next change that happened that really made a big difference was in 1900. There was a man by the name of Joshua Lionel Cohen. He was quite a character, but he was quite a scientist in many ways too. He liked to experiment with electricity, and he did things like make electric motors, and he used the electric motors to do things like run a fan. These were all things that he tinkered with and tried. Again, in 1900, electricity was pretty much a new toy, so it was something that could be experimented with, and there could be innovations that would make a real difference. Cohen came up with something that was almost like a train. He built a circle of track out of metal, and he got a box, and the box looked like the box next picture. Yeah. He had a box with wheels on it. And you see he constructed the track and he put the track on actual ties. It looks like a cheese box. And guess what? It probably was. Now again, he did not construct this to be a toy. That was not his intention at all. He just thought it would be something that could run around a circle in a store window, and that it would attract people to the store window to see the other merchandise. In other words, there could be dresses, there could be appliances, there could be even food items, but people would be attracted to the window simply to see the moving train. Well, it turns out that when the people went in the store, they said they didn't want to buy the dress, they wanted to buy the little train. Lionel figured this out, and he started making these things, and he actually sold the individual trains. So there's quite a few of them still in existence. But that was the first electric train, basically. Again, it was not intended to be a train, and it was not really intended to be a toy. It was simply intended to be something to attract people to a window. The real innovation occurred, though, in the 1920s, and a little bit earlier. Lionel started making electric trains at this point. And these electric trains, he called them standard gauge trains. Let's take a look at those. Here they are, rather big monsters. This one, for example, is a Lionel, and you'll see that they're actually much larger than O gauge trains. They're actually about G gauge size, and they're big and they're very, very heavy. This one, for example, is an Ives. And it's a wonder that any kid would be able to play with something like that, because who knows if a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old would even be able to lift it. It turns out, though, that although Ives went out of business a few years later, they made a pretty realistic train. If we see in the next picture, this is a this is a Penn Central S2. This is an electric train. And these trains were developed because although there were tunnels underneath the cities, the large cities in the east, using steam engines in the tunnels was kind of a dangerous problem. The smoke, of course, from the engine didn't do the engineer any good, and it also obscured the trains. So sometimes there were wrecks and accidents. And so electric trains were developed in the bigger cities of the East Coast to run in these tunnels under the streets. And they did that with a pantograph. You see the pantograph here? These pantographs are very low because the tunnels were low. So there was a wire that these pantographs could actually attach to. And that gave the engine the electrical power it needed to run. Well, it turns out that actually, if you compare the picture and the Ives engine, it's a pretty fair representation of what that train looked like. But again, at this particular point in time, these trains are just simply toys. They're not meant to be actual replicas, of course. But of course, the kids enjoyed them and played with them. In the very early days, these electric trains ran on batteries. That was a pretty expensive solution, of course. But as electricity crossed the country, people would attach a cord up to the light fixture, and then they were able to actually run their train. Standard gauge trains, though, were quite expensive. These were not trains that were for ordinary people. In fact, basically you could say the standard gauge trains could only be afforded by rich families. Our next picture shows exactly who these rich families were. Here we see two kids playing with their Lionel trains, and they have a standard gauge train, and the train, of course, is chasing the dog. Look at the way they're dressed. Suits and ties. Guess who dressed them in the morning? It was probably their nanny. These are not working class kids. These are kids that come from very wealthy families that can afford these large trains. Because, of course, this was a problem, standard gauge had to give way to another scale. There had to be a cheaper solution. And standard gauge trains basically were stopped being made in the 1930s. However, before that happened, American Flyer made standard gauge trains, Lionel made them, a company called Dorfin, and of course Ives was producing them. But by the end of the 1930s, they pretty much had disappeared. Now there is a remarkable thing that has happened, and that is a few companies have resurrected standard gauge trains and have made copies or replicas of them, so they can be purchased today. But of course you can always buy used ones. And another thing to remember about these trains, these two trains happen to be 100 years old, and yet they still run. They still run. The nice thing about trains is they were made like Swiss watches, and they were made very carefully. Both of these trains have two motors, and they run still pretty well. Notice the big light bulb on the end of it. People always ask me, well, why were the light bulbs so big? Well, you have to remember that back in the 1920s, they didn't have small light bulbs, so that was the best that they can do. So that's a characteristic of standard gauge trains, those big light bulbs. The solution for Lionel and for other companies was to go to something smaller. And as a result of that, O-scale trains were invented. And O-scale trains were much smaller. And most of them, of course, still ran on 3-rail track. So American Flyer was producing O-scale trains, and Ives was producing O-scale trains, and certainly Lionel was producing O-scale trains. We can take a look at the sizes of the trains. I'm sorry, O-gauge American Flyer. Show O-gauge American Flyer. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Boy, he's going to have to cut this baby. Sorry. Here's an example of an O-scale train. And you'll see that it's actually much smaller than standard gauge. This particular train, by the way, is American Flyer. And again, it's all made out of metal. It's an attempt to make a replica of a train that actually existed. Again, a train that would run in a tunnel in a big city in the East Coast. And once again, you've got the big light bulb, because of course, again, the light bulbs could not be made that much smaller. And again, it's got pantographs on them that are fairly low so that it can go through a tunnel and reach the wire. This particular train also is 100 years old, and it runs pretty well considering its age. The couplers on it are actually latch or hook couplers, and that's how you hook the cars of the trains together. So these trains would be sold in sets, and all the cars would be made out of metal. Usually pretty colorful, but all made out of metal and not really too realistic. Our next picture shows you what you can do with a 4x8 train. This is a 3-way O-gauge train on a 4x8 piece of plywood. Notice there's room on this 4x8 piece of plywood for 2 tracks, which suggests that you probably could run 2 trains on this particular layout. There are switches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Switches that give you the ability to go from one part of the track to another. And there's also room for a big yard where you can store cars in between times when you're using them. In this case, they've decorated the train board probably with something that looks like trees. But you could also get plastic buildings and put those on them. And by the way, the easiest way to run this train would be in a conventional way with just a transformer. A transformer that has 2 wires, and you hook the 2 wires up to the track. To run 2 trains, the easiest thing to do would be to separate the 2 circles and have 2 transformers. And this would allow you to run 2 trains at the same time. Easy control. A board like this could be set up on a pair of sawhorses, or it could be put on maybe rollers and maybe even stored underneath a bed in a room. Or you could bring it out on a carport and run it on a sunny day. There's many, many ways to use it. But of course, you don't always have to put your track on a board. Many people still run their trains on the floor. And if you're young enough to get down that low, well, I guess that's probably the way to go. In part 2, we will discover how trains became model trains. We'll give you a little bit more of a history of it. There was a big event, of course, that occurred at the end of the 1930s, and that was the tensions that occurred in Europe. And the resulting tension caused World War II. And World War II is going to make a profound change in the way trains operate. We'll see that in our section of part 2. So for now, I'll sign off, and we'll see you next time and hear a little bit more about the history of trains and why I love them so much. Okay?